The notice arrived on a Wednesday, not in an envelope, not hand-delivered. A single email sent at 11:52 at night from a property management address that auto-populated as no reply, informing Marcus Webb that his lease on Bay 7 of the Colton Street repair lot would not be renewing. The acquiring company had plans for the space. He had 45 days to vacate. Marcus read it at his kitchen table. His daughter Amara was asleep in the room down the hall. She was 8 years old, and she had not had an easy year, and he did not intend for her to know about this until he had already done something about it. He closed the email, set the phone face down on the table, and sat in the quiet for a while. Then he made a list. He had run Bay 7 for 3 years and 4 months. He had built it from a single wrench set and a used hydraulic jack to a functional operation with a 6-day work week, 4 steady fleet accounts, and a wait list that told him something precise about the value of what he had built. The bay was not his. The floor, the ceiling, the roll-up door, the wall hooks, none of it had ever been his. He had understood that from the beginning and had told himself it was temporary and had not moved fast enough. And now, the consequence of that delay was sitting in his inbox with a no-reply address. He was 34 years old, he had $9,000 saved, and he had 45 days. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been moving carefully for a long time. His mother had raised him and his younger sister in a rented flat in South Lewisham on a home care worker's salary, and she had operated by a rule she repeated so often it had stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like gravity. You cannot afford to waste anything. Not money, not time, not attention. He had taken that rule into everything. Into school, where he had studied mechanical engineering and finished 2 years early by overloading his course credits every term. Into his first job at a commercial fleet maintenance depot, where he had arrived early every shift for 4 years and had not spent a single unnecessary pound of his wages. Into Bay 7, where he had kept his overheads lower than anyone who looked at his revenue would have expected. Because Marcus Webb did not spend money he had not already earned twice in his head. He had not, however, moved fast enough to own the ground beneath him. That was the specific mistake, and now he had 45 days to not repeat it. He spent the first week looking at available commercial properties within a 3-mile radius of his current client base. There were 7. 3 were priced beyond what any structure of financing he could realistically construct would support. 2 were available on short lease terms only, which meant he would be having this same conversation again in 18 months. 1 had a drainage situation that a 1-hour inspection made immediately disqualifying. The 7th was a property he had already dismissed twice before, and for reasons he had told himself were sound. It was a garage on Whitmore Lane, a standalone structure, roughly 800 square feet, built in the mid-1960s from brick and corrugated steel. The roof had a visible dip at the western end. The roll-up door was seized. The electricity had been disconnected at the mains for what the listing described as an undetermined period. The lot it sat on was weedy at the edges, and the concrete apron in front had cracked along 3 significant fault lines. The listing price was described as negotiable, and the seller was identified as Halcyon Property Associates, which was a subsidiary of a firm called Alderman Group, which Marcus had had to look up because the name meant nothing to him. He called the contact number on a Friday morning. Victoria Alderman had not built Alderman Group by accident, and she would have told you that directly, without performance. She was 43. She had spent 15 years acquiring land and property in the secondary commercial tier, below the level where the large institutional money operated, and she had become very good at identifying the gap between what something was worth on paper and what someone would pay to own it. The gap was where she worked. The gap was where she had made everything. She was not a careless person. She was, if anything, too certain, the kind of certain that closes its own eyes. She had acquired the Whitmore Lane site as part of a package deal the previous year, a 7-property portfolio she had purchased from a retiring developer at a figure that made the individual asset values largely irrelevant. What mattered was the aggregate. The aggregate had been good. The Whitmore Lane garage was what she had called, in the meeting where the acquisition was signed, dead weight. A structure that predated any coherent planning vision for that part of the borough, sitting on a lot too small for meaningful development, and too deteriorated to attract a serious tenant. She had listed it to get it off the balance sheet. She had listed it at £800. Her asset manager had suggested she might take less. When the man on the phone said he wanted to arrange a viewing, she had her assistant schedule it and did not attend herself. She sent 2 people, her asset manager, a young man named Daniel who wore lanyards with keycards on them and carried a tablet at all times, and a structural assessor from a contracted firm who had done 3 previous jobs for Alderman Group and whose reports tended toward the pessimistic end of the spectrum. Marcus arrived before them. He had gone the day before on his own, on a Tuesday afternoon, and walked the exterior twice and looked through the gap in the seized roll-up door with his phone torch and stood at the edge of the cracked concrete apron for a long time looking at the surrounding street. He knew this part of the borough. He had driven through it regularly for 2 years because it sat on a route he used to reach a fleet client on the other side. He knew what the streets adjacent to it felt like at 7 in the morning and at 6 in the evening. He had noticed things, the way that people who pay attention to physical space over long periods notice things that were not in any listing document. He said nothing about this when Daniel and the assessor arrived. He listened to the assessor describe the structural deficiencies in a tone that suggested the building was performing below the expectations of buildings generally. He walked the interior with his own torch and said nothing beyond clarifying questions about the electrical disconnection and the lease terms. He crouched at the northwest corner and pressed his palm flat against the floor and looked at the slope of it. He stood under the dipped section of roof and looked up at the corrugated steel and the light that came through the 2 small points of separation in the panel seam. He asked one question when the tour was finished. "What's the number?" Daniel looked at his tablet. He said that the listed price was $800, but that given the structural assessment and the disconnection costs and the condition overall, Ms. Alderman had authorized him to go as low as $600. He said this in the manner of a person delivering good news. Marcus said he would go to $900 if the transfer included the full lot boundary as registered, and if the sale completed within 14 days. Daniel blinked. He looked at his tablet again as though it might explain what had just happened. He said he would need to check with Ms. Alderman. He checked that afternoon. Victoria Alderman, who was in a meeting when Daniel messaged her, replied in 40 seconds. She said yes. She added, and Daniel read this part out loud to Marcus over the phone when he called to confirm, that she hoped the buyer understood what he was taking on. Marcus said that he did. He signed the papers on a Thursday morning in a solicitor's office on a high street that smelled like carpet cleaner and photocopier toner. Victoria Alderman was not present. She had sent her solicitor, a compact woman named Frances, who processed the documentation with professional efficiency and shook Marcus's hand at the end with the slightly puzzled expression of someone who has completed a transaction they do not entirely understand. Marcus drove directly from the solicitor's office to Whitmore Lane. He unlocked the side door, the roll-up was not yet operational, and stepped inside. He stood in the middle of the floor and turned slowly and looked at everything without moving for approximately 2 minutes. Then he took out his phone and called his sister. Her name was Priya, and she had been the first person he had called the night the email arrived, not because she had money, which she did not in any quantity that would help, but because she had the specific quality of not telling him things were going to be fine when she did not know that they were. She had said on that first call that he should sleep and make the list in the morning. He had made the list that night anyway. She would not have been surprised. He told her he had bought it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, 900. 900. Another pause. He could hear her processing it. She said, and the lot. All of it. She made a sound he recognized as the sound she made when she was not going to say that something was a mistake, but was not yet ready to say it was not. Then she said, right, what do you need? He told her what he needed. He needed an electrician who would take payment in 2 stages. He needed access to a commercial concrete supplier through any contact she had from her construction project management work. He needed her to look after Amara on the 3 Saturdays while he worked, starting this weekend. She said she would handle all of it. She asked if he had eaten that day. He said he had. She said she did not believe him and that she would bring food on Saturday. He said that was not necessary. She said she was aware of that. The first 2 weeks were structural. He fixed the electrical in the sequence that made the most financial sense, lighting first, then the compressor circuit, then the secondary outlet ring for diagnostics equipment. He had done this kind of work before, not as an electrician, but as a man who had spent 11 years in workshops and knew how systems connected to each other. He hired a registered electrician named Terry for the panel work and the certification sign-off, because Marcus did not cut corners that would come back to him legally, and he paid Terry in 2 transfers as agreed. The roll-up door took a full day. The mechanism had seized from years of inactivity, and the spring tension had relaxed past the point where manual adjustment was sufficient. He ordered a replacement spring kit and sourced a used motor unit through a commercial parts board online. He fitted both over a Saturday that started at 6 and finished at 9:30 in the dark, with Amara sitting on a folding chair inside the garage doing homework with a head torch, because it was the only way Marcus could be near her and still be working. She had asked him, when they drove there that first Saturday morning, if this was theirs now. He said yes. She looked out the window at the brick facade and the weedy concrete apron and the seized roll-up door. She said, "It needs work." He said it did. She said, "Are we going to do it?" He said yes. She nodded once, the way she had begun to nod at things that had been decided, and got out of the car. By the end of the first month, the garage was operational, not finished, not decorated, not anything beyond functional, clean floor, working lights, working door, a compressor that ran properly, a drainage channel that he had resealed at a cost of £42 in materials, and 8 hours of work he did not bill to anyone. His fleet clients followed him. They had told him they would, but until each one made that first call to the new number and drove to the new address, he had not fully believed it. The first one arrived on the 3rd day. The second came the following Monday. The third took until the 2nd week and required Marcus to drive to the depot and stand in front of the fleet manager and say, calmly, that the work would be the same, the rates would be the same, and the address was different, and that the manager knew better than most that what mattered was not the postcode. The fleet manager said he would send the first vehicle that Friday. He sent 2. By the end of the 2nd month, Marcus had a waiting list, not a long one, 6 names, but 6 names meant that the capacity of one man operating 6 days a week was not equal to the demand available, which meant something specific about the future. He had been watching Whitmore Lane with the same attention he gave to everything, not the garage in isolation, the entire street. He had been watching it since before he bought the building, but now that he was on it every day, he was watching it the way you watch something you intend to understand completely. Whitmore Lane was 400 meters long. His garage sat at the midpoint. At the northern end, there were 2 commercial units, a former print shop that had been vacant for 4 years, with a to let sign so sun-bleached it had become decorative, and a general goods wholesaler operating on reduced hours that Marcus had observed to be, in practice, 3 days a week. At the southern end were 3 properties, a locksmith who had been there long enough that his sign had become part of the street's visual identity, a dry cleaners operating under a lease that one of the dry cleaners' employees, a woman Marcus had learned was named B, had told him was expiring and not likely to be renewed, and a corner structure that had been vacant since before Marcus could trace. He had looked up the planning history. It had been a public house, then a storage unit, then nothing. He spent 6 weeks looking into the ownership of each of those properties before he said anything to anyone. The 2 northern units were held by a single landlord, an individual named Reuben Stroud, who had inherited them from his father and who, Marcus established through careful inquiry, had been trying to sell them as a pair for 3 years without success, because buyers kept pulling financing at the final stage. The dry cleaners was leased by an elderly Jamaican couple who had been trading there for 17 years, who did not own the freehold, and whose lease was held by a property holding company registered to a solicitor's office in the city. The corner property belonged to Alderman Group. He called his sister. "The whole street," he said. "I want to understand if it's possible." She did not respond immediately. When she did, she asked him what he knew about the planning situation for that area. He told her what he had spent 3 evenings researching. There was a Phase 1 transport infrastructure grant that had been awarded to the borough 9 months earlier. The award was not widely publicized. It was listed on the Borough Council's planning portal in a document that was 47 pages long and whose executive summary had been covered by a local newsletter with a readership of approximately 300 people. The grant funded a road corridor improvement project on 2 adjacent streets, both of which fed directly onto Whitmore Lane. The project would improve access, reduce transit time to the nearest bus interchange by 11 minutes, and formally reclassify the lane's zoning from light industrial to mixed commercial use. The reclassification was the thing. Mixed commercial use meant ground floor retail or service businesses. It meant footfall. It meant that a street which currently looked like something that had been set aside was about to be reclassified as something the borough had decided to develop. The formal announcement was estimated at between 9 and 14 months from the date of the grant award, which put it somewhere between 3 and 8 months from the present. Property values in the reclassified zone would begin moving before the announcement, once the planning documents started circulating more widely. After the announcement, they would move fast. Marcus had bought his garage for £900 6 weeks before he understood any of this. He had bought it because he needed ground and because his instinct about the street had told him something before the research confirmed it. That sequence was important. He had not bought it as an investment. He had bought it as a place to work. The investment had emerged from the work of paying attention. He spent 2 weeks structuring what he needed before he made a single approach. He went to Reuben Stroud first. He chose Stroud because Stroud's situation was the cleanest. 2 units, 1 cellar, 3 failed sales, and a man who by every piece of evidence Marcus had been able to find was tired of carrying a liability he had never wanted and did not know how to exit. Marcus wrote him a letter, not an email. A letter on paper with his name and address at the top, setting out who he was and what he was proposing and why he believed the number he was offering was fair to both of them. He proposed $62,000 for both units on a standard transfer, payable on completion. He did not have $62,000. He had worked out with his sister's help that he could finance it. His business accounts were 3 months old at the point he was writing the letter, and 3 months was not a long trading history. But the revenue was consistent, and the fleet contracts were documented, and Priya had a contact at a commercial lender who had done community business loans for smaller operators and who would look at the full picture rather than a single metric. Stroud called him 4 days after receiving the letter. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for someone to offer him a plain deal. He had questions. Marcus answered them. They met in person twice over the following 2 weeks, not in a solicitor's office, not over a formal table, but in Stroud's kitchen and then in the empty units themselves, walking around them while Stroud pointed at things he thought Marcus should know about, and Marcus looked at them and said nothing beyond what was necessary. They agreed at $61,000, the financing confirmed in 18 days. The dry cleaner's freehold took longer because the holding company required a different kind of approach. The couple who ran it, Winston and Marvella Clark, who had been on Whitmore Lane since before the area had any of its current character, were not the obstacle. The obstacle was a company registered to a solicitor's office that had changed hands twice and whose current operator had no particular attachment to the asset beyond the income it generated. Marcus had Frances, the solicitor from the original garage transaction, who he had called again because she had processed his first deal with the kind of efficiency that told him she knew what she was doing, make the initial approach. The approach was straightforward. He was offering market rate for the freehold. His offer was not contingent on the Clarks leaving. He intended to offer them a renewed lease at terms below what they were currently paying. because a street with a business that had been there 17 years was more stable than a vacant unit, and stability was what he was building. The company sold. The clerks were given the new lease terms at a meeting Marcus held in the garage, standing, because there were not enough chairs. Marvella looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Marcus and asked him what he expected from them. He said he expected them to keep running the business the way they had run it, and to tell him if the building needed anything attending to, because he intended to be a landlord who attended to things. Winston said, with the particular quiet of an older man who has dealt with enough landlords to have developed a taxonomy for them, that he would believe it when he saw it. Marcus had the guttering on the dry cleaners replaced the following week. He had not been asked. He had noticed it on his way past and had it done. He did not mention this to anyone. The corner property was the last piece and the most complicated, not because Victoria Alderman was difficult to reach, but because when her asset manager recognized the Whitmore Lane address and cross-referenced it against the buyer's name, there was a pause in the negotiation that Marcus understood to be something other than a standard commercial delay. He waited it out. He did not follow up aggressively or alter his offer or give any signal that he was operating with urgency. He had learned, from years of working on engines, that forcing something that has seized will damage it. You apply the right amount of pressure at the right point, and then you give it time. Victoria Alderman called him directly 7 days after the offer was submitted. It was the first time they had spoken. Her voice was controlled in the way that professional voices become controlled, not cold, but managed, with a habit of not giving inflection to words that other people would inflect. She said she had read his offer. She said she understood he already owned several properties on the street. He said that was correct. She asked what his plan was for the corner unit. He said he was going to convert it into an affordable workspace for small trade operators. Single bays, shared equipment, below-market rents, fully managed. He said there was a demand for it in the area that no existing provision was meeting. She was quiet for a moment, not a hesitant quiet, a thinking quiet. She asked if he had financing confirmed. He said he was working on it. She said that she would accept his offer on the condition of a 60-day completion window to allow him to finalize the financing. She said this without the surrounding language that people often use when they are doing someone a favor and want them to understand it as such. She said it in the same register she might have used to confirm a meeting time. He thanked her, he meant it. She said one other thing before the call ended. She said that she had sold him the garage at £900 and had called it dead weight in a meeting she now found herself wishing had not been minuted. She said she was not in the habit of explaining herself, but that she wanted him to know she had been looking at the land and not the street, and that she understood the difference now. He said that he appreciated her saying so. She said she was not saying it for his benefit. He said he understood that too. The corner unit completed on a Thursday. Marcus stood at the entrance of it the same afternoon after the keys were transferred and looked the length of Whitmore Lane from its southern end to its northern end. The sun was low, and the brick facades on the east side had gone amber, and the dry cleaner's sign was lit in its yellow and green, and the roll-up door of his garage was open, and he could hear the compressor inside. He had been on this street for 7 months. If you have been here since the beginning of this story, drop a comment with the word Whitmore. I read every single one. And if this is the channel you have been looking for, subscribe now, because the next one is already built, and it does not end where you expect. The workspace units in the corner property were listed on a Tuesday. By the following Thursday, all 5 bays had been allocated. The operators who took them were a mobile welder, a bicycle repair specialist, a small appliance electrician, a key cutter who had been operating from a market stall, and a woman named Adana who made bespoke leather goods and had been working from her kitchen for 3 years because she could not afford workshop space anywhere within reasonable distance of her home. Marcus met each of them individually before the leases were signed. He did not do this because it was required. He did it because the same thing that had made him a good mechanic had made him understand that what you put into a space determines what comes out of it, and he was particular about what he put in. Adana asked him, at the end of her meeting, why the rent was below market. She was not asking it with suspicion. She was asking it with the careful precision of someone who had been caught off guard by generosity before and had learned to identify what it was covering. He said that below market rent on a full building he owned was still rent, and that a street with 5 working operators in one unit was worth more to the overall value of what he was building than a vacant corner with a higher nominal figure attached to it. She considered this. Then she said, "You're thinking about the whole street?" He said yes. She said she had not met a landlord who thought that way before. He said that was probably one of the contributing factors to the shortage of affordable workspace. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that acknowledges an accurate observation. She signed the lease. The planning announcement came in month 7. A formal press release from the Borough Council, covered by 2 local outlets and 1 regional property publication, confirming the road corridor improvement project, the infrastructure investment, and the reclassification of Whitmore Lane and 3 adjacent streets from light industrial to mixed commercial use. Marcus was in the garage when Priya called him to tell him it had gone live. He was in the middle of a brake job on a fleet van and his hands were occupied. He put the call on speaker and continued working. She read him the relevant sections. He listened without comment. When she finished, he asked her what the independent valuation estimate was showing for the lane. She had already pulled it. She gave him the figures. He listened to them. Then he said he would call her back in an hour and returned to the brake job. The figure Priya had given him was not surprising. It was, within a reasonable margin, what he had projected when he first understood the planning situation, when he had sat at his kitchen table 11 months earlier and worked through the numbers methodically, the way his mother had taught him to work through anything that mattered. You did not arrive at a number and hope it was right. You built toward it from first principles, and then you waited to see how close you had been. He had been close. The call from Alderman Group came 6 days after the announcement, not from Victoria herself, from her solicitor. A formal expression of interest in acquiring some or all of the Whitmore Lane properties at a figure that reflected the post-announcement valuation. Marcus had Francis draft the response. It was 4 sentences. It thanked them for their interest. It confirmed that the properties were not available for sale. It wished them well with their portfolio. It was signed by Marcus Webb, Director, Webb Properties. He had registered the company name the month before. He had told Priya when he did it. She had said it was a good name. He said it was accurate, which was the same thing as far as he was concerned. He went to the street alone on a Sunday morning in the 7th month, the week after the announcement, before the operators had arrived and before the lane had its weekday presence. He walked from the northern end to the southern end and stood at the corner property and looked back at what he could see. The 2 units at the north end had new window glazing, which he had fitted in month 4 because the originals had been single pane and the operators he was about to bring in deserved a building that retained heat. The dry cleaners sign was off at this hour, but the frontage was clean and the guttering was straight. His garage sat at the center with the roll-up door closed, and the name above it in the letters he had put up in month 2, with a stencil kit and exterior paint, and Amara's guidance on the spacing, which she had delivered with the authority of someone who understood that these things mattered. She was right that they mattered. The name above the door, the straight guttering, the new glazing, the 5 bays with 5 people in them making things with their hands, these were not incidental. They were the substance of what he had built. The valuation figures that Priya read to him over the phone were a consequence of those things. They were not the thing itself. He had bought a garage for £900 because he needed ground and because he had looked at the street and registered something before he could fully articulate what it was. The £900 had not been an insight. It had been a requirement. The insight was everything that came after, the list made at midnight, the letter written to Reuben Stroud, the meeting in the clerk's front room, the call with Victoria Alderman, the 5 operators in the corner unit. The insight was the cumulative result of paying attention and then acting on what attention produced. He had been told by the email at 11:52 on a Wednesday night that his situation was closing. The email was accurate. His situation had closed. And in the space where it closed, he had built something that would not close because it was his, because the ground was his, because he had moved in the right direction at the right speed, with the right amount of pressure applied at the right points, and because he had not wasted anything, not money, not time, not the particular quality of attention that his mother had given him, and that he intended to give Amara in whatever form she could carry forward from it. He turned and walked back toward the garage. He had a van arriving at 9. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me what to build next. Subscribe if you are not already and leave a comment with the moment that landed hardest. I read every single one and the next story is already waiting.